For decades, Norway has played a major role as a peacemaker. From conflict resolution to reconciliation, promoting peace has been a central aspect of Norwegian foreign policy. Many have recognized and lauded Norway's efforts as a peacemaker. But this is only part of the story. Few will be aware of the thriving, lucrative, and government-owned weapon industry in the country. Today, I am joined by Nic Marsh, a senior researcher at PRIO and a specialist in arms trade, and General Kristin Lund, a retired senior officer of the Norwegian Army and the first woman to command a UN peacekeeping operation. I am Arnaud Siad, and you're listening to PRIO's Peace in a Pod. Nic, General Kristin Lund, welcome to this episode. Nic, when researching this, I have to say I was a little bit surprised to find that Norway even had a weapon industry. Before we get into details, can you give us a bird's eye view of Norway's position in the global arms trade? How big of a player is it, and how significant is it for Norway's economy?
Yeah, certainly. Norway's ranked about 22nd in the world as an arms exporter. So in global terms, it's a sort of medium-sized player. Definitely not huge, but not insignificant. And certainly Norway has a much larger industry than does other similar-sized European countries such as Ireland or Lithuania or Austria. Although interestingly not as big as Switzerland, which is another state which is often thought of as being, a very peaceful nation, but also has a large defense sector. In terms of the importance of the industry in Norway, economically, it's not a big sector. I mean, manufacturing overall is just about 5% of Norwegian GDP. The defense sector is a small part of that. So overall, it's not a huge sector, but it is important regionally. And it's especially important as it's a source of high-tech industrial jobs that are outside the oil and gas sector. So, long-term, Norway needs to have other industries as the oil and gas revenue will decline over time. And so it's important for Norway to have these alternative industries.
Right, so let's get into the details of it. There are two major players in this, I believe. The first is Kongsberg Defence and Aerospace, a subsidiary of Kongsberg Gruppen, which is a major Norwegian enterprise active in the defense, aerospace, and offshore oil and gas industries. The Norwegian government holds a majority stake in Kongsberg Gruppen, meaning just above 50%, which means the Norwegian government essentially controls pretty much most of it. The second player is Nammo, the Nordic Ammunition Company, a specialized provider of ammunition and missile systems. And just like Kongsberg, it is partly owned at 50% by the Norwegian government. So we're looking at arms companies where the Norwegian government has substantial, if not a majority ownership and oversight. Nic, how are these two companies integrated into the global arms trade? Who are they selling to, and where does Norway lose sight of its products?
Yeah, the two companies make almost all of their sales to other NATO members or to similar countries in terms of developed democracies such as Australia. You've had some exports to developing countries or countries outside that zone, but they've been a very small part of Norwegian exports. In terms of where Norway might lose sight of its exports, a lot of what is produced in Norway is components which are exported to manufacturers elsewhere and then made into larger weapon systems. So then, yes, there's definitely a dilemma for Norway or any other country producing components. It's very difficult to know exactly where those components will end up if they're going to be exported, further on down the line.
General Kristin Lund, you have a distinguished career in both the Norwegian Armed Forces and UN peacekeeping missions. And as I've said, Norway is often seen as a peacemaker, but maybe we also misunderstand what Norway and Norwegian foreign policy is. I mean, the country is a founding NATO member, the largest military alliance in the world. So from a military standpoint, and to our listeners, can you tell us what are some of the core principles that guide Norway's foreign policy? What is Norway's ambition in the world?
It's a large question, but I will try to, from a military point of view, I can say, when it comes to the Norwegian foreign policy. And I'm very lucky that our government, in a way, are the one to decide whatever we do. And they have decided that the defense forces have 9 tasks. And they are, of course, deterrence as a part of the NATO alliance. It's defense of Norway and allied countries. It's handle security crisis episodes around our natural resources. We have exercise of authority. That's, we control the fishing quotas in the Northern Sea, Barents Sea, around Svalbard. We have the border control up at the Russian border. We claim Norwegian sovereignty and sovereign rights. We are also facilitating the government for the security and intel needed to make good decisions. And of course, we contribute to social security within Norway, or like we have the total defense concept. We participate in multinational operations. We contribute to international security and cooperation around. I think that's more or less those 9 tasks. What is it for Norway in a way to do all this? So we do both things for Norway and outside. I will say that it is like, to participate in when other people need help, we help. Because we have a good country ourselves. And of course, we know the importance of take care of our security, interests, and values, and that we want to also, in a way, contribute to others. So I think it is, to say it very kind of blunt, it is to have a peaceful world. And our foreign policy is always said in a way that Norway, because we are a small country, we don't try to impose our things on others. So in one way, we can talk to everybody.
You just mentioned that, one of the goals of Norway, really the overarching perhaps principle might be that we want to have a peaceful world, you said. So my question to you then is, how do these principles you've just mentioned reflect that balance between Norway's wanting to build a peaceful world and other strategic priorities, namely its weapon industry?
Well, as just Nic also told us, that, it's not a large percentage of Norwegian GDP. But of course, because of the changing world and the enormous, what have changed the last 10, 15 years, the development in technology makes it important, because a lot of these technology that is used in the weapon industry is also used in the civilian life. So it's a kind of a win-win. It's the wrong word to put it, win-win, but you do research for technology that can be useful in hospitals or elsewhere, and then it could also be useful in the military.
So are you saying that some of these components being built by Norwegian industries do end up ultimately in social goods such as hospitals, etc.? Is that what you're saying?
I think so, but this is not my area of expertise. But just making small chips, a chip can be put within a hospital, then it put it in a boat or an airplane and have a same function.
Nic, same question to you. How do you think Norway reconciles its role as a peacemaker with that of an arms exporter? And I'll refer back to the episode we did with UN UNRWA chief Philip Lazzarini and the Norwegian Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs Andreas Motzfeldt Kravik 2 months ago. And I was struck by how forcefully Norway came out in support of UNRWA, for example, the Palestinian Refugee Agency. And to me, this was in line with what people think of Norway and foreign policy, right? Norway as the mediator in the Oslo Peace Accords, Norway as the giver of the Nobel Peace Prize. So I'm trying to figure out how you think Norway reconciles this with its role as an arms exporter.
Yeah, I think the key thing to remember is that, as Kristin mentioned, promoting a more peaceful world has for a very long time been a Norwegian priority, but Norway has never been a pacifist nation. It's always had military forces. Since the end of the Second World War, it was part of NATO, and it developed its military industries in the 1950s and 60s with a partnership between government and industry. And there's, for a country such as Norway during the Cold War, it was in a very vulnerable position, having a border with the Soviet Union. And likewise now, Norwegians are feeling very vulnerable in the current security environment. And so when you have a country which has armed forces, which is prepared to use military force, you then have a dilemma which is felt by many other places. And that's because the defense industries operate usually on what's often referred to as a feast and famine situation, in that you will often get a very large government order, people are very busy, and then there's nothing for years, maybe even decades. So if you're going to have domestic defense industries, you then need to work out, okay, what are we going to do with them in between our own domestic orders? And the answer for Norway and many other countries is, okay, we'll export. And so the arms exports are a sort of consequence of Norway wanting to have its own industry, not wanting to have to rely completely on other countries to equip its armed forces. So then there is, as you said, a dilemma there. You want to export, but if you also want to promote peace in the world, you don't want to export to everyone. I remember many years ago a Norwegian diplomat quipped that Norwegian policy is we will only export arms to people who don't need them. That's not completely true, and certainly now not true in terms of Norway's support for Ukraine. But there is a sentiment behind that, in that for a long time Norway has had a pretty strict regulations on where it would export weapons. There was a parliamentary declaration which ruled out commercial exports to areas involved in wars. So Norway has tried to sort of follow a path in between promoting a more peaceful world and having a defense industry which relies on exports. But there has been some criticisms. That's pretty much inevitable. For example, Norway was critical itself of the US-UK invasion of Iraq in 2003, but Norway didn't stop supplying arms to those countries. And likewise, if we're looking at more modern scandals, there has been some equipment was exported to members of the Saudi-led coalition involved in the war in Yemen. Again, in total, very small amounts, but it did happen. And also, with the current situation in Gaza, Norwegian companies have been involved in making components which are then exported to the US, and a part of F-35 fighter aircraft which have then been exported to Israel and have been used in the bombing. So it's not completely the case that you only export arms to people who don't use them, but there has been a sentiment behind that.
I think this is an important point, and one that some of our listeners will be particularly curious about, given Norway's very loud advocacy for a ceasefire in Gaza. You're saying that some of the Norwegian-made components in weapons do end up in Gaza.
Well, it depends how you mean by in. In the airspace over Gaza. Yes, that's happened. I don't think there's any debate that has happened. The dilemma for the Norwegian government is: do you prevent further exports of those components? That would obviously help to reinforce Norway's position on what's happening in Gaza. There's been a court case in the Netherlands, for example, in which the Dutch government was found to be in violation of international law in allowing similar exports of components. So there's a strong case that should happen, but on the other hand, you have to recognize there would be political, economic consequences for doing that.
I just had a comment for what Nic said a little earlier, by having our own industry. We can just use the pandemic as an example, because then everything kind of closed down. Then just an example of cars, that's not important, but just that you were totally dependent on pieces from other countries that was not coming because of the pandemic, for example, or the war in Ukraine, where they were actually manufacturing special parts to BMWs. So you see that if we are totally dependent and have no industry of our own, we are very vulnerable. And I think that's also an important matter for having an industry of ourselves, so we can make things that we need to protect ourselves.
And I'm wondering whether there is a discussion taking place in Norway as to potentially not selling weapons or halting the sale of even components if they end up in places like Israel. I know there's been conversations in the country about potentially boycotting some export, not necessarily military. So I'm wondering if there's any conversation taking place at the moment around that, Nic?
Yeah, I mean, there have been discussions, articles in the media, etc., about that. So it is an ongoing debate, definitely.
Yes, especially the Save the Children has been very active towards our government with Gaza to make sure that Norwegian ammunition doesn't, that you can track back to what is happening there. When you are interested in security policy, you will see that there is a lot of debate. And I think that also, in a way, force our government to be even more stricter. And every kind of export from Norway has to be, even though it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that are handle it, it has to be decided by the government. And I think that it cannot be the industry. They have to go via. And I think that's at least a good thing. But I'm quite sure that it will be even more. Now it's so difficult because you have these companies that sometimes you cannot see who is actually behind those companies that are buying, that can in the first place look very great and straightforward, but then we realize that are other actors behind. So it's a jungle out there now.
And Kristin, I'm wondering, what do Norwegians make of this? Are there polls, are there studies with public opinion as to how they feel about being an exporter of weapons in the first place?
I haven't seen directly, I have never been asked, called up, what do you mean about it? But there is a lot of polls when it comes to having defense forces and so forth. And that has been very positive because of what is happening. There's a neighbor that is involved in a war. So the people towards having a defense and a strong defense has shown just yesterday by getting more money into the defense forces. So the general opinion is good because people understand, but I'm quite sure that the Norwegian people doesn't tolerate if our government sell weapon or components to and using it, if they are then breaking international laws. And I think that's one of the kind of red lines, you cannot sell, export.
Yeah, I agree with Kristin, and especially if you look at the parliamentary debates. There's been some debate, controversy over specific exports, but there's very few calls for Norway to not export anything at all or to not have a military industries.
Nic, given what we have discussed today, how transparent is Norway regarding its arms sales? Are there strong regulations and oversight?
In terms of the regulations, in general, they're fairly strong compared to several other European countries. If you're looking at exports to dictatorships, governments committing serious violations of human rights, there's far less of a problem about Norwegian exports than there is, say, concerning French exports or exports from the United Kingdom. So the regulations there are fairly tight, but it would be an exaggeration to say the strongest in the world. For example, Japan has traditionally had much stronger regulations than Norway has. In terms of transparency, Norway does produce an annual report on its exports. It submits data to the UN, etc. But the level of detail in that reporting has, I think, got less over the years, and certainly Norway has been criticised by some civil society organisations for being less transparent than a lot of other countries, not living up to some of its international obligations to be as open as it could be. So again, the message is it's not terrible, but it's not the best either.
Right, and going back to where we started in this episode, you said that this is ultimately a small part of Norway's GDP. And I'm wondering, what impact does the Norwegian arms trade have on international conflicts? Are there specific regions or conflicts where Norwegian's weapons have played a critical role?
It'd be difficult to say that sort of arms with made in Norway on the side has had a critical role in specific conflicts, just because it's a niche player in the global industry. Norway's exports are far lower than the United States or Russia or China, for example. If you're looking at where Norwegian arms are being used, as I mentioned earlier, they're mainly exported to other NATO members. So if you're looking at wars involving NATO members, then you'll probably find some Norwegian equipment being used in there. But yeah.
Kristin?
When it comes to equipment, very often you will see that the equipment are parts of a larger platform. It's not a total complete platform. And I think that's also important. The only thing where we can see more complete is within ammunition. But when it comes to other components, it's a part of a larger platform.
Nic, as we wrap this episode, and particularly in light of the war in Ukraine and increasing tensions around the globe, are we seeing any changes in Norway's arms export policies?
I mean, the big thing that's happened in recent years is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then we've seen Norway being one of the largest, absolutely, but also one of the largest, in a per capita basis, countries supplying weapons, ammunition to Ukraine. And we're looking at Nammo, the company we mentioned earlier, trying to significantly increase its ammunition production as a response to that invasion, and also due to more general European fears about the long-term military security situation. So the big change has been the sort of focus on Ukraine.
And I think just to continue what Nic said, I think the Ukraine, in a way, have been an eye-opener for the Norwegian people and also the defense people, in a way, how much, because this is a conventional war, and how much actually ammunition and what is actually going is enormous. So I think that has been an eye-opener, and that's also why we see and feel the support to the defense forces, because you see what it actually takes for the whole society, not only the defense, but the whole society as a whole. And that's why I think also we see in Norway with the total defense why it's so important. I mean, the defense is only one of the tools. The other tools rest within our society, and they are as important.
Nic?
Yeah, just to follow on from what Kristin was saying, I mean, there's been two realizations within Norway, but Europe more generally, that firstly, as Kristin said, the European production, particularly of ammunition, but across the board, has been based upon, assumptions that there wouldn't be a major war in Europe. So you had very small production of very high technology goods in general. And, over the last 2 years, people have been realizing that isn't nearly what is needed to fight a major conventional war in Europe. And secondly, there's a realization, given Biden's problems in getting the aid for Ukraine authorized, that maybe we can't rely on the US to come in and save us, and particularly if there's another Trump administration, we don't really know what's going to happen, and all of these things feed into attempts within Norway and Europe more generally to build up defense production, and that will obviously have an effect on exports and a sort of focus on exports within Europe as well.
General Kristin Lund, Nic, thank you very much. This episode was produced by Arnaud Siad and edited by Brage Pedersen, with sounds from Nobel Media. Find out more about PRIO's events, op-eds, and publications on PRIO.org.